Hi, and welcome to our next video on semantics pragmatics. This week's topic is going to be intersubjectivity. During the last 2 weeks, we talked about historical approaches to how the linguistic sign and its referent are connected in our minds by means of the concepts that we have in our minds when we think of something. We talked about the fact that the sign and the referent are not directly connected. They are connected only by an arbitrary linguistic convention. But what directly combines the linguistic sign and the linguistic referent is the concept that we have in our minds. And during our last 2 weeks of discussions, we talked about how this connection, this relationship between the linguistic sign and the referent was seen in the ancient Greek tradition as two different approaches. One was Socrates' idea that some meanings, at least, some words are given by gods or are somehow naturally correct. On the other hand, we also saw the conventionalist approach by Hermogenes, who said that, oh no, this concept of the relation between the referent and its name, the word that we use to refer to him, is completely arbitrary. Last week we saw that one of these traditions, the naturalist idea about meaning, or about concepts in this case, has continued even into the 20th century when we talked about the so-called language of thought. Today we're going to talk about the other tradition that we already saw during the first week when we talked about Plato's Cratylus, and that is conventionalism. So last week we more or less arrived at the conclusion that mentalese, or the innate language of thought, is probably not the best way forward. But if not mentalese, then what? What can we use instead? And in this situation, the Finnish philosopher and linguist Esa Itkonen might actually help us out. He has written a number of books and texts about how language meaning is actually, how can we arrive at common meaning of the words that we use without the need of any innate layers in our cognition, by the means of a concept that he called intersubjectivity. Esa Itkonen was, or is, he's still alive, is a critic of nativistic or naturalistic views of language that were, and still are, advocated by such figures as Noam Chomsky and also Jerry Fodor. At the same time, Itkonen is also against the purely subjective approach to conventionality that we have seen in Hermogenes' position in Cratylus, where he said that he could simply swap one name for the other, and to say, for example, horse, if he means man, and the other way around, if he pleases, because it's just arbitrary and only a convention, and anything I choose will be the correct word. But this is not, as we will see today, this is not really possible. Against this radical conventionality or radical subjective conventionality, Another person also was very much opposed. That person was Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued against the so-called in his so-called private language experiment. I'm not going to delve any deeper into that, but there were many people, not only Esa Itkonen, who saw that language is not as conventional and not as arbitrarily alterable as we might think if we say that language is arbitrary. Right. So before we start our discussion on intersubjectivity, let us begin with some introductory questions. So suppose you want to talk with someone about a given topic, let's say cows, and try to think about the answer to the following questions. What are actually the preconditions for a successful conversation? And by preconditions for a successful conversation, I mean, what do all parties in that conversation have to know in order to communicate? And where does this knowledge come from? If we say that this knowledge is not innate, that we do not have an innate language of thought, so-called mentalese, so how did we arrive at this knowledge? How did we acquire it? And if we say that language is conventional in nature, as we said last week, for example, what evidence do we have for this conventionality? And if the linguistic sign is indeed conventional and arbitrary, why don't we see much more of the behavior proposed by Hermogenes, that simply a horse can be called a man and a man can be called a horse and nothing happens? We'll try to answer these questions in this video. And we'll start by thinking about what we actually know about language, about our own linguistic knowledge. What do we have to know to be able to communicate with others? So imagine this situation. Two persons are on a walk, Martin and Henrik, and they see a cow. And Henrik wants to talk about this cow. So what does Henrik need to know and what does Martin need to know in order for them to be able to communicate about a cow? See, first of all, Henrik needs to know that cow, the string of sounds k, a, u, cow, means the animal that he sees on the pasture, cow. Furthermore, Henrik also has to know that Martin knows the same thing, namely that cow means cow. And finally, Henrik also has to know that he's not alone with this knowledge, that Martin also knows that cow means cow, and at the same time that Martin knows that Henrik knows that cow means cow. This is basically the concept behind this is fairly simple, but in order to describe it, you really need this highly complicated set of knows 1, knows 2, knows 3, and sort of 3 different layers of knowledge. But bear with me, we're going to manage to understand everything in this video. So, what we now know is that we need 3 levels of knowledge in order to have a successful communication. And in order to distinguish these different layers of knowledge or different knowledges, in the literature they refer to those as knowledge 1, knowledge 2, and knowledge 3, and also the according verbs, right? Know 1, know 2, know 3. There are also situations possible and feasible where you have even more layers of knowledge, where there would be knowledge 4 or knowledge 5. But those knowledges are very improbable and very impractical for a larger language community. The exceptions to this rule might be, for example, spies, double agents, or situations when a couple of people, for example, play a card game or a board game where you have to maintain sort of a fake identity in order to solve a problem, something like that. But normally, in speaking, in normal conversations, you really only have the 3 levels of knowledge about language. Right. So now, let's think for a while about how we know 1, how we know 2, and how we know 3, right? So the first question is, how does Henrik know that the word cow means cow, right? And then the second question would be, how does Henrik know that Martin knows the same thing? And thirdly, how does Henrik know that Martin knows that Henrik knows what cow means? Well, on the first level, knowledge 1, we have introspection. And this is pretty straightforward, right? So we can simply introspect our minds and we know what we know. I know that if I want to refer to the animal on the picture, I will say the word cow. This is something what I mean, what I know in my head. On the second level, knowing what other people know, this is not enough. And what I need is a certain amount of empathy, right? So, and by empathy, I mean the fact that I can relate my own introspection to other people. And I can imagine that if I have been able to introspect my mind and come and arrive at the conclusion that cow means cow, other people are also capable of doing that. So we have empathy. And at the third level, we have intuition. And this basically means that if we have, by means of empathy, arrived at the fact that our interlocutors probably know the same thing as we do, we can expect them to do the same thing. And if we have managed to think that they know, we can expect that they have done the same thing. And that we both know that we both have a certain shared knowledge. The terms here, introspection, empathy, and intuition, are not really that important. What is important is the principle behind that. And these 3 overlaying levels of knowledge. Right. Now, a couple of remarks about the difference between knowing something and expecting something. Right, so I've been talking about knowledge and how Henrik knows things, but the fact is that Henrik and everybody actually, every member of a language community can only have knowledge 1 about the meaning of a certain word. The knowledge that is achieved by introspection. Knowledge 2 and knowledge 3, so the knowledge about what other people know or think, is based solely on our empathy and intuition. That means that we know the meaning of words, but what we know about other people is only based on expectations, right? So we can't know what other people know, but we can expect something, right? And so we can sort of change a bit this scheme that I've introduced a second ago, and say that Henrik knows that cow means cow, and the rest is expectation, right? Right. And now let's have a look at how this actually, where is this intersubjectivity that I've been talking about? So the first level of knowledge, knowing something by introspection, right? So we know that cow means cow, is a subjective thing. We have no way of determining whether this is correct or not. It may be the case that only we, as individuals, use the word cow to mean to refer to the animal on a farm, cow. Right? We cannot determine whether this is correct or not. The same also applies to knowledge too. This is also subjective, because we cannot know, we have no way of determining whether our expectations about other people are correct or not. It is only on the third level that we see how other people react to us and how other people behave. Right? That we can conclude that they have the same, or at least similar enough, knowledge and expectations about us as we have about them. Right? It is only in action that we see that if we say cow and point to the animal on a pasture, other people understand what we mean, right? But this is only achieved as a third step. If we were locked in a room without access to other people, we wouldn't be able to know that, right? And this is the basis for intersubjectivity, right? We know, or we know something, and we know that other people know that we know that. And based on that, other people expect us to behave in a certain way. And now I'm talking about behavior, but I mean linguistic behavior, right? And that means that Martin and Henrik, in the example that I gave, cannot arbitrarily change the language. And this is why it's not really that it's not really possible, for example, for Hermogenes to start calling a horse a man, and a man a horse, and be fine with it. Surely we can do that, but we will not have success in communicating with others, right? And this is sort of this intrinsic normativity in language that is the basis of the intersubjective relations that are necessary for us to communicate with others. At the same time, it doesn't mean that nothing will ever change, right? So there is certain room for changes, for being innovative, but this intersubjective character of meaning or of linguistic norms, linguistic signs, also prevents us to completely change the system at once. So language can change, and we know that language changes, but it is only possible in a limited room. And by the way, this is also something that we know from other contexts as well. It's not only language, right? So, for example, think of a theater or an opera as a similarly intersubjective situation, right? So, probably you know that you are supposed, if you go to an opera, you would normally, you know that you are supposed to be looking something like this, right? A black tie or tuxedo, jacket at least. And you also know that other people expect you to behave like that. Of course, in certain situations, even if you go to an opera or a theater, it might be okay to look less formal and to, for example, wear jeans or to look slightly different from what you expect or from what other people expect of you. But on the other hand, you are not completely free in what you're doing, right? So, for example, you can't take a Speedo or a bikini if you are going to an opera. I mean, you can do that, but the reaction of other people will probably be unpleasant to you, at least. At least people will look at you, people will frown upon what you're doing. And if you're okay with that, then go ahead. And the same thing with the example of homogenies. Of course, you can call a horse a man and a man a horse, but people will react to it. And you then have to live with the reaction. And in some situations, the reaction might be smaller. In other situations, the reaction might be a bit harsher, but you will still get a reaction. Right. So, and again, this is an intersubjective thing, right? So we know how we are supposed to go to an opera. We know that other people know that as well. And we also know that other people know that we also know how we're supposed to look like if we're going to an opera. Right, so what are the consequences of this intersubjective approach? And for instance, if we think about the difference between the human language and, for example, other forms of communications in the animal kingdom, bird songs, whale songs, behavior of dogs or other animals that we see around us, we'll actually see that they behave similarly or that they follow the same principles, right? So dogs barking or bird song will also work according to these intersubjective principles. And similarly, we also see that human language is in this regard not really that different from other forms of non-linguistic behavior in humans. Right? For example, street traffic. We see that cars usually don't crash into each other. It's not the case that there are daily thousands of people dying on the streets because they get run over by a car, because people know what the rules are and they know that other people know. So it works. And the same with societal hierarchies, for example, or in smaller contexts, behavior at parties. Right? So you know what is expected to you if you go to a dinner party, or if it's a birthday party or a baby shower, things like that. You know how to behave. You know that other people know how to behave. And you know that the other guests at the party know that you also have the knowledge. And by that, you have sort of a limiting normative intersubjective network that prevents you to go like anything goes, right? You can still change the expectations. And you know that probably from your own lives, that you can change whatever people are expecting from you to do. But it takes time, and it only goes one step at a time. And the same is true for language, if we think about that as an intersubjective matter. Right, so to sum up, last week we've discussed an approach to meaning called mentalese, or language of thought, that works with the idea that we have concepts in our heads that are innate. And language then is learning a language is then simply learning how to translate these innate ideas that we have in our heads into words. But today we've learned that that there is also a different way, right? That way is based on interaction between individual speakers. We have a concept in our heads. We know what a cow means. And by interacting with other peoples, with other persons, with other speakers of the same language, we will learn that they also have the same concept. And we'll get feedback. We know that that is the case. And by doing that, we'll arrive at this three-layered intersubjective level of knowledge that is needed for us to understand language and to use it in all of these different contexts accordingly and correctly. Okay, that was all for today. Thank you for watching and see you next week.